What do you call a fruit that is afraid of commitment? A cantaloupe. For Halloween, I'm dressing up as commitment because everyone is afraid of it. I found a website for people with commitment issues, but I don't want to sign up. Now, I know all of those were not home runs. I'm just introducing a topic, and our topic today is commitment. Jesus said, "Where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there among them." And where Jesus is, there is commitment. Our commitments shape our lives. In many ways, our commitments are the way that we choose our own future. Our commitments develop us or they defeat us. Either way, our commitments define us. And this is why Jesus talked a great deal about commitment. This is why Jesus makes a big ask of us in regards to our commitments. And this is why Jesus asked us to prioritize our commitments and make sure that our primary commitment, our first commitment, is to God. While he was teaching, a lawyer approached Jesus to challenge him. This is the only place in Matthew's gospel where the word lawyer is used. We're not exactly sure what that word means. This person is not a scribe. Matthew had that word. He could have said scribe. So some have conjectured that this was a professional theologian or a scholar of the law, someone who was very familiar with the Jewish law. What we do know is that this is not a courtesy call from the lawyer. This lawyer is hostile and adversarial, and he approaches Jesus to entrap him. Teacher, or rabbi, he says, not out of respect. Which commandment is the greatest? Here's the trap. At that time, it was conventional wisdom that there were 613 commandments in the Jewish scriptures, and each one of them was to be upheld. To name one as greatest, that wasn't what they were thinking. Jesus responds by quoting the same scriptures. He quotes the Shema, part of the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy. This is Israel's foundational claim. We are to love God and God alone with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind. Only God is to be worshiped and obeyed. To love anyone or anything else in the same way we are commanded to love God is idolatrous, and that's worshiping other gods. One of the statements of faith from the Presbyterian Book of Confessions, the Scots Confession of 1560, says it this way: we confess and acknowledge one God alone, to whom alone we must cleave, whom alone we must serve, whom alone we must worship, and in whom alone we must put our trust. This is to be our number one commitment. And the second commitment, Jesus continues, is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. We are not to love our neighbors in the same way that we love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, but we are commanded to love our neighbors in the same way that we treat ourselves. So every break, every forgiveness, every strength, everything that we hope for ourselves. That is what we are to give our neighbors. This is not just a vague understanding of goodwill. It is not just letting your neighbor borrow your snowblower. Yes, that season is coming. What Jesus is talking about here is a new vision for social reality, a new vision for how people like us live together with the people in the houses on the street, with the people in the houses on our island, with the people in the houses downriver, with our entire community. We are to live in a new way, depicted in this beautiful painting by John Augustus Swanson. It is a utopia. There's justice in relationships. The poor are provided for. The homeless and the hungry have what they need. There's no stealing, there's no lying, there's no defrauding, there's nobody calling you on your cell phone, trying to entice you into something you shouldn't be involved in because all they're after is your money. Loving our neighbors in this way is not a transactional, market-driven kind of economy. Jesus is after a whole new social reality. So he tells the lawyer, and he tells you and me, these two things are the things to commit ourselves to. We are to dedicate our lives to these two commitments. Love God. Love your neighbor. Love God with every fiber of your being. And anything and everything you would do for yourself, do that for your neighbor. There's a relationship between these two commitments. We do not truly love God if our love for God does not lead to loving our neighbor. That is true. These commitments overlap, but they are not identical. We cannot collapse the one into the other. It is not enough just to love our neighbor. According to Jesus, these are two commandments, two commitments. So in our own lives, we are to have an identifiable, a definable, and recognizable love for God. An identifiable, definable, and recognizable passion or drive or commitment to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind. Augustine of Hippo, ancient saint of the church, helps us think about what Jesus is saying here. Augustine lived in the second half of the 4th century. He was a bishop, a theologian, a prolific author, and he wrote that what sin is in the lives of people like you and me is disordered love. It's not a sin to love. God created us with this amazing capacity to love, but sometimes we get our loves out of order so that we love lesser things too much and great things too little. So that our loves are out of order. To commit to anyone or anything else more than God or equal to God is just inappropriate and disordered. So that when we value too much the things of this world or our personal opinions or our particular agenda, or we love some things too little, that we don't have enough time for our drive and our passion and our commitment to God. Things are out of order. We are to love God with our whole being first, and everything else will fall into place. Jesus told that lawyer those things because our commitments shape our lives. In many ways, we choose our future through our commitments. Our commitments can develop us. Our commitments can defeat us. Either way, our commitments define us. When it's time for me to do a funeral for someone, what I do is sit down with the family and just let them talk and reflect about their loved one. And what I'm listening for is the person's commitments, what that person was committed to throughout their life. And then when I stand here and do a eulogy, I just try to tell the story of their commitments. Because that's where God was in that life. That's where God was working in that life. That's where God's presence and love and grace was made known through that life. That's where God's work was done, through that life, through their commitments. In fact, the history of the human race can be told in terms of commitments. When you look at the history of civilizations, it's often written in terms of human discoveries and inventions and wars and artistic creations and everything else, including kings and presidents. But at the heart of history, underneath it all, there's stories of promises, pledges, oaths, compacts, commitments that were kept or not. And those are the story of our lives too. Our lives are a story of commitments, wise and foolish, sustained and broken, fulfilled and failed. This past week, my mother-in-law, June Clapham, died. She was 90 years old. June was Marguerite's stepmother, and Janet's too. Their actual mother died when they were young women. Marguerite's father, who's here today, Janet's father too, Bob, and June were married for almost 40 years. June was a woman of commitment. She was a loyal Presbyterian. A few years ago, when we moved Bob and June downriver to be closer to us, we talked to them about joining a church and even suggested this one, and June only had one question. It was not, who's the minister? June, I'm the minister. And it was not, are the people nice? It was not, do they have good food at the potluck? Her one question was, is it Presbyterian? Yes, it really is. And that comment reminded me that what a church is a community of commitment. We are the one community on earth that tries to uphold Jesus' two commitments, to love God and love neighbors. We are in the commitment business. Our goal is to empower people to make commitments, to keep commitments. And we uphold Jesus' words, love God first and love neighbors too. And so that together we'll grow and increase in those commitments. Now, here's another reason why I know June was a loyal Presbyterian. She played golf 10 days before she died. Now, it wasn't until June was in her mid-80s that I could score as well as her at this particular game. Presbyterians love golf. She died suddenly, but not unexpectedly. It was 12:30 in the morning, and when Marguerite and I got over to their assisted living center, and things had happened so fast that Bob wasn't aware of what was going on, and we needed to tell Bob and then accompany him back up to their room for a final goodbye with June before they took her body away. We were at June's bedside, and we were sad, and we were sobbing, and Bob hugged and kissed June and said, "She's so young and beautiful." And he was absolutely correct. She looked angelic. I am telling you, there was a glow. And she was at peace. And it was absolutely beautiful. And then Bob said, "And she was too young to die." And Marguerite and I looked at one another, and we finally said, "Well, Dad, she was 90 years old." And he looked up and said, 90 years old? And you're 93. I'm 93? It was a moment of transcendence. In that moment, their commitment had totally slipped out of time as we know it. There was no young, there was no old, there was no yesterday, there was no today and tomorrow, there was no calendar, there were no years to count. In that moment, at that time, it was timeless. It was a moment of eternity. That's what happens with our commitments. That's what happens with our commitment to God and our commitment to each other and our commitment to love. Before we realize it, before we understand what is happening, our commitments become timeless. This is going to happen to you someday. We never really know. Our commitments are never really settled until we get to the very end. And then we look back and we think, yeah, I blew that one. And then we also know, I got that one right. And that wasn't just me. That's where God gets into your life through your commitments. So Jesus makes a big ask of us. Jesus asks us to make the most important commitment of our lives. Because commitments shape us, because commitments tell the story of our lives, and because at the end they slip into eternity, Jesus asks us, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Because this is what's going to last forever.